Imagine this. You're Jeffrey Epstein, not the heir to some wealthy grandmother, not a graduate of the right schools with the right last names on donor lists. You don't have seed capital, you don't come from a family with billion-dollar companies, and there's no obvious reason why anyone should even bother talking to you. By all conventional logic, you should have faded away into office cubicles, routine, a comfortable middle-class life. Instead, you end up in places where outsiders aren't allowed, and not as a one-night guest, but as a permanent fixture. Around you are presidents, heirs to empires, cabinet ministers, scientists with Nobel ambitions, old-world European aristocrats. They fly on your planes, stay in your homes, accept your invitations, and then when your name surfaces in the press, they start acting as if it all came to them in a dream. Some say they remember nothing. Others claim they never knew you. A third group bristles with irritation, as if they've been caught not in an awkward moment, but in a crime. This doesn't feel like an ordinary scandal. It feels like a collective attempt to forget. The central question isn't what you did. The real question is who you actually were. A financier without transparent books? A broker between money and power? Someone who served the interests of foreign intelligence services and was therefore untouchable? Or a figure who grasped a simple truth? Elites aren't afraid of exposure. They're afraid of losing control of the narrative. Money is secondary here. What matters first is knowledge and leverage, even if it's never spoken out loud. Now we're going to tell the story of how your life might have unfolded if you were Jeffrey Epstein. Get comfortable. This will be interesting. Strip away the mystique, and your starting point looks almost ordinary. You weren't born into a closed club, just New York, a regular family, no financial cushion. In the mid-70s, you're teaching math at an elite private school in Manhattan. On paper, you're a teacher. In reality, you're someone who spends every day among the children of bankers, senators, and corporate owners. Math isn't the important part. What matters are the conversations, the habits, the tone of voice, the understanding of how people behave when they're used to the world owing them something. And of course, access to the elite through their children. Then comes the leap that still hasn't been properly explained. You land at Bear Stearns, an investment bank, without the standard career ladder, without a public track record, without the reputation of a star trader. Options, complex financial structures, clients with enormous money, and even larger fears. In that world, you learn the essential lesson. Not how to make money, but how to serve people who don't want to leave footprints. A few years later, you leave and set up your own operation, described in the vaguest possible terms. Consulting, asset management, help with non-standard situations. No one ever manages to articulate exactly how you make your money, but there's enough of it to live the way only people with access to other people's assets live, not their own. The turning point is Leslie Wexner, an American billionaire, owner of L Brands, a man with real money and real influence. From that moment on, everything falls into place. Property, planes, legal protection, status. You don't become a public tycoon. You become the man next to the tycoon, and that's far safer. You don't appear in rich lists, but decisions flow through you. From there, everything accelerates. Mansions in New York, islands, closed-door receptions, fashion shows, introductions that never make it into any official record. And yet, you still don't have a biography that can be neatly broken down point by point. You're officially unnecessary everywhere, and therefore, necessary everywhere. You don't build corporations, don't enter politics, don't cultivate a public image. You collect connections. You study weaknesses. You remember who likes what, who fears what, and who must never end up under the spotlight. At this point, the story stops being about a strange career rise, because a man without pedigree, without formal power, and without a clear source of income suddenly becomes someone it's better not to argue with, and better not to remember. How he got there is a question that still has no answer. From here on, Epstein is no longer a biographical character. He becomes a symptom of a system in which silence is worth more than reputation, and disappearance is sometimes more convenient than explanations. The simplest, and at the same time, most explosive question in this story sounds almost childish. Where did the money come from? On the surface, everything looks respectable. Asset management, private deals, shepherding complex financial structures, advising clients with entry thresholds too high for ordinary banks. The language is familiar. The money exists. Its origins aren't discussed. Everyone around you seems to understand what you do, but the moment someone asks for specifics, the conversation slides into vague generalities. It feels like everyone knows. But when you try to put anything on paper, it turns out no one can actually confirm a thing. This is where the story slips into a colder, more unsettling register. Alongside the financial explanation, another one emerges, far less comfortable. In this version, money isn't the goal. It's the tool. Your entire career isn't a success story, but a cover legend. And you yourself aren't an independent player, but a function. In these conversations, Mossad comes up most often, less frequently the late-stage KGB or the structures that grew out of it. Not as proven fact, but as a hypothesis that explains far too much far too neatly. The mechanics are disturbingly simple. A man appears out of nowhere. He's quickly elevated, helped to legitimize his biography, shielded from awkward questions. To the public, you're a financier. To the inner circle, you're a carrier of connections. From there, everything depends on you. You collect contacts, observe, remember, and at the right moment you work not with money but with weaknesses. Vanity, fear, dependency, the desire to remain inside the circle. There's no direct proof for this version, but there's also no transparent explanation for how a man without a public business lives for years at the level of the ultra-rich. It's precisely this void that makes the question toxic. When there's no answer, imagination always outruns the facts. This same framework fits almost too neatly with the figure of your closest associate. At your side was always Ghislaine Maxwell, not a random companion, but someone who knew everything and was embedded in every process. She would later be sentenced to 20 years in prison for her role in your crimes, which in itself speaks to the depth of her involvement. Her background adds yet another layer. Her father, according to a number of investigations, was an agent for multiple intelligence services and worked particularly closely with Mossad and the KGB. An extraordinary coincidence. A man with that history, and his daughter becomes a key operator in a system suspected of having an intelligence dimension. Then comes the most revealing part, your social circle. Judging by published materials and the so-called black books, you operated on a scale that suggested you had no interest in small change. Politicians, financiers, artists, scientists, members of royal families. The list reads like the program of a closed forum whose attendees never officially confirm they were there. And what matters here isn't accusation, but logic. You were almost never the most important person in the room. You were the one who assembled the room. For years, you built yourself into a hub, a person who connects, introduces, creates spaces where status replaces scrutiny. Dinner, reception, flight, conference, private party. The formats changed. The principle stayed the same. You didn't go to Epstein. You went to the people he had already brought together. And then basic psychology kicked in. If former presidents, billionaires, and Nobel laureates are nearby, it must all be legitimate. You can relax. Politicians and media figures regularly moved through your orbit. People who shaped the public agenda. Bill Clinton, George Stephanopoulos, Andrew Cuomo, John Kerry, Tony Blair, Michael Bloomberg. A separate layer consisted of celebrities and the cultural elite. Harvey Weinstein, Woody Allen, David Copperfield, Naomi Campbell, Katie Couric, Michael Jackson. Even academia was unexpectedly dense. Stephen Hawking, Noam Chomsky. In company like that, you didn't look like the host, but like a convenient connective element, the person in between, without whom the meeting simply wouldn't happen. Figures from the business elite also kept appearing around you. People who don't need podiums, but exert influence through money, technology, and infrastructure. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Reid Hoffman, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, Ronald Perelman, Tom Pritzker. This isn't a social scene or a club of shared interests. It's a network where information is valued more highly than reputation. And finally, there's one more detail that doesn't fit the image of a private financier. The documents mention a politician from an Eastern European country that is now in conflict with Russia. The same politician who travels around Europe with an outstretched hand, asking for money to keep the conflict going. In correspondence with economist Lawrence Summers in May of 2019, you discuss the need to step up support for the well-known country currently in conflict with Russia, both economically and militarily. And of course, you deliver a shocking assessment of the former comedian who is now president. You toss off a line. This president is under heavy pressure. He's an actor, right? Hardly a second, Reagan. The reply comes back. I know the people who finance him pretty well. The exchange is calm, emotionless, as if they're talking about a mid-level manager rather than a head of state. In a later email, the tone hardens. You no longer hide your irritation. Does he even understand what he's doing? He looks like a typical Eastern European adventurer selling a story of national pride. For voters, it's cheap theater, but it's strange when he starts playing that role in front of our investors. The implication is stark. Your files, released by the U.S. Department of Justice, lay bare the essence of the current conflict with Russia. It's all a staged performance, designed to generate billions of dollars. And then, in the same trove of correspondence, another conversation surfaces, this time with a representative of the Rothschild family. They're discussing the events of the 2014 crisis in that same well-known country, now in conflict with Russia. The wording is brief and businesslike. What's happening is creating new opportunities. The context is brutally practical and deeply cynical. A country is sinking into political crisis, and for someone, it's a chance to make money. Another distinct layer in your system is old aristocracy and royal households. Your connection with Prince Andrew has long become a symbol of the entire story. In the same circle appear Mette Marit and other members of Europe's nobility. You stay in touch with Sarah Ferguson, help her sort out financial issues, take part in delicate negotiations within closed families. You come up in conversations where last names matter more than titles, and decisions are made without minutes or protocols. Your phone book looks like a cross-section of global power. Rupert Murdoch, Richard Branson, David Koch, Mohammed bin Salman, Ehud Barak. What matters here isn't the status of the meeting or the format of the interaction. What matters is the point of contact itself. The contact is noted, the conversation remembered, the tone registered. In this world, even a brief exchange functions as an asset. The main version discussed by journalists and analysts sounds rational enough. You don't seek public power or build an image. You collect vulnerabilities. Sometimes they're concrete episodes. Sometimes it's simply knowledge of context, circumstances, and sequences of events. You don't need to apply pressure. You gather information and strike at human weaknesses, dark appetites and dependencies. It's no surprise that years later, many people explain their presence around you in exactly the same way. Dropped by for dinner, happened to be passing through, met on a recommendation. Everyone is afraid. And if that's the case, it means they have something to hide. And then the most interesting part begins. In this story, a place emerges that eventually becomes its symbol. You own the private island of Little St. James and present it as a natural extension of your life. A closed space, far from cameras and random eyes. A place where the outside agenda ceases to exist. Formally, the island looks like private property for a limited circle of guests. A resort without hotels, without tourist traffic, without accidental visits. You can only get there by invitation. Very quickly, it gains a reputation as a place where no one asks questions. No one is interested in the reasons for your visit or how long you plan to stay. Everything is built on trust in the owner. Over time, a detail comes to light that changes the perception entirely. The island, conceived as a place of seclusion, is saturated with a surveillance system. Cameras cover key areas, track movements, control access. Privacy here is selective. It exists for guests only as long as it aligns with the owner's interests. Everything else is carefully preserved. According to case materials, you deliberately seek out young girls in different countries and arrange their transport to the island, exploiting the weaknesses and secret desires of your guests. These are not spontaneous trips or chance encounters. A well-oiled system is at work. Private flights, coordinated routes, minimal contact with the outside world. It's this system that later comes to be called the Lolita Express, not referring to the name of a plane, but to the mechanism itself. In the end, Little St. James becomes a concentration point for the entire story. Money, logistics, control, silence, all converge in one place. A location created for isolation turns into an archive, and that's why the island keeps resurfacing in every conversation about the case. It vividly shows what a closed world looks like, where status matters more than rules, and silence is the most valuable resource of all. From there, you reach the very point many people have been following this story for, the moment of the new files. At the end of January, the U.S. Department of Justice releases another massive batch of documents, and expectations instantly go through the roof. People are waiting for something simple, a list, names, direct links. Instead of a dramatic punch, what appears is an archive, huge, heavy, and awkward to process. You grasp the scale immediately. Millions of pages, hundreds of thousands of images, thousands of videos, email fragments, investigators' working notes, internal discussions, testimony. It's a data dump that shows what the system looked like from the inside. It doesn't offer a neat, linear narrative, but it gives a sense of depth. There are fewer answers than people hoped for, but it becomes clear just how widely everything was spread. Familiar names surface inside the files. Musk, Gates, DiCaprio, Bezos, Woody Allen, and others appear in emails, third-party comments, and working notes. Investigators are careful to state up front. A mention of a name is not an accusation, but for an ordinary reader, that disclaimer isn't enough. The mere presence of these figures in the same body of material forces a different set of questions. Who actually shapes the agenda today? Who gets labeled as thought leaders? And why do these particular people keep showing up near a story surrounded by so much dirt, money, and silence? Musk, Gates, Richard Branson. Are they entrepreneurs, visionaries, moral compasses of the age? Or just members of closed circles with appetites not everyone is invited to share? Some of the correspondence reads oddly. In places, trips and meetings are discussed. Elsewhere, phrases flash by that could easily be pulled into headlines. Musk publicly and deliberately says that documents like these can be weaponized for reputational attacks, and stresses that he's interested in accountability for those actually involved in crimes. Others whose names appear say much the same thing. Almost immediately, everyone goes on the defensive. No, it's all fake. These files are smearing our good name. What stands out separately is your own writing style. You speak freely about global politics, assess leaders, speculate about Europe's future. You attribute to Macron ambitions to play a much larger role than he publicly admits. In other emails, you talk about opportunities for influential families amid international crises, including the conflict between Russia and the well-known country. It all reads like the perspective of someone who views global upheaval through the lens of leverage and control. The files also contain testimony from victims. Investigators document it, discuss it among themselves, cross-check it against other materials, and, as expected, everyone whose name appears publicly denies involvement. Lawyers, statements, press offices go into non-stop mode. But for an outside observer, a different effect takes hold. Even if these files don't prove the guilt of specific individuals, they raise an uncomfortable question. Why do the same figures keep appearing alongside stories like this? And who really shapes values and reference points in a world where influence has long ceased to be public? And now, imagine this is where things really get interesting. The legal hunt for you, Jeffrey Epstein, begins. In the spring of 2005, everything surfaces not because of reporters or internet gossip, but for the most mundane reason imaginable. Someone files a complaint at a police station. Just a routine report to the Palm Beach police, which at first glance looks like another farce from Florida's upscale swamp. Stories like that pop up all the time there. And most of them get buried in an archive labeled "Not Our Problem." But this time, somehow, it was their problem. The police didn't brush it off and took the case seriously. It dragged on for almost a year, evolving from a modest inquiry into a full-blown investigation. The FBI was brought in, warrants were issued, your residences were searched, and suddenly, coincidence began to look suspiciously like design. Inside the mansion, investigators found artifacts that didn't fit the mask of an eccentric wealthy man at all. Cameras, photos, recordings, address books, not random trinkets, but an entire ecosystem where everything was thought through, down to the smallest detail. Detectives questioned witnesses from those lists and began to spot repeating patterns. Different voices, different settings, but the same direction. This no longer smelled like misunderstandings. It looked like a well-tuned machine. Ironically, the kind of machine that usually runs quietly until it breaks. By 2006, the Palm Beach police publicly stated that there were solid grounds for a serious case. The materials were handed over to state prosecutors, and a grand jury was convened. And here begins the chapter that would later be revisited with a cynical smirk. Despite the mountain of evidence and stories, the finale was absurdly small. Instead of a bundle of serious charges, the jury landed on just one. For something of this scale, it was like trying to examine an elephant through a keyhole. Then everything slid into what came to be known as the deal of a lifetime. A federal investigation that had piled up volumes of documents was suddenly put on hold. You negotiated an agreement that shielded you from further federal prosecution and even protected your associates from being charged. On paper, it was all perfectly legal. In reality, it was an elegant cleanup. The victims learned about this farce after the fact, and a court later pointed it out plainly as a violation. But who cares when the stakes are that high? On paper, the punishment looked severe, 18 months behind bars. In reality, a regime so soft it made people blink. You were placed in a separate wing of the county jail, allowed to leave daily for work at an office, and after 13 months, you were released on probation. Even during this probationary circus, you moved between your villas as if nothing had happened. Formally, a criminal. In practice, a gentleman who had merely adjusted his schedule. Public reaction followed, but without fireworks. Palm Beach cops openly scoffed at the prosecutor's softness. Newspapers blared about the deal of the century. Some politicians and foundations returned your donations. Others simply looked away, didn't see it, didn't hear it. Universities, charities, high society, everyone reacted in their own way, but without a unified surge of outrage. The saga faded again, at least for a while. It was in this pause that the key aftertaste crystallized, the feeling that everything was under control. The trial had happened, the verdict was in, the echo was minimal. Epstein didn't disappear, didn't sever his ties, didn't look broken. He simply carried on, quieter, more cautious, but with a firm confidence that the mechanism had been tested. The limits were clear, the risks calculated. How neatly the system works for the chosen few, right? Now imagine this, my friend. After several years of near total silence, your saga bursts back to the surface on an epic scale. By 2019, all the journalistic digging, public anger, and legal wrangling over that old deal finally did their job. Federal sharks in New York decided to dive in without the old courtesies. No silk gloves, just bare-knuckle reality. On July 6, 2019, you're arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. This time, no preliminary bargaining. Federal charges, maximum publicity, and everyone who once bragged about knowing you suddenly waving it off. Who's that? Can't recall. A new rule of elite etiquette: distance yourself or go down. Soon after, searches hit your Manhattan mansion. Investigators reported a trove of evidence allegedly crucial to the case, along with curious extras: stacks of cash, glittering stones, documents that raised more questions than answers. It felt like a sudden set change. Instead of cozy offices with coffee and hushed conversations, there were rigid protocols, cracked safes, and sealed doors. The story slipped out of control and, for the first time in ages, rolled onto the tracks of ordinary justice. How ironic for such a master of control. The judge was blunt: no bail, even when eye-watering sums were offered, even with guarantees. It was a clear signal that the game had changed, and old tricks wouldn't work. You were locked in a federal detention center where flexibility isn't part of the vocabulary. For someone used to private jets and VIP treatment, it was a new quest, and, by all accounts, a brutal ride. After that, events accelerated. By late July, you were briefly placed under extreme supervision, then returned to standard conditions, typical bureaucratic churn. On paper, everything followed procedure. In practice, the system cracked wherever it could. Checks that were supposed to run like clockwork happened sporadically. Paperwork was filled in after the fact. Oversight existed more for appearances than for reality. On August 10th, 2019, you were found unresponsive in your cell, a finale worthy of a Hollywood thriller. The official line came out dry and neutral. Medical examiners ruled it a suicide, citing a range of factors meant to explain everything. But doubts immediately surfaced about the nature of the injuries and the technical failures in supervision. They didn't outright overturn the official conclusion, but they turned it into a permanent playground for conspiracy theories. The follow-up investigation concluded, supposedly, that there was no elaborate intrigue at all, just sheer incompetence. Prison staff were overworked. Rules were routinely ignored. Reports were freely falsified. The ending was as mundane as it gets. A couple of reprimands, suspended sentences for guards, and an official admission that the entire system was crippled by staff shortages and poor conditions. No grand reckoning, no cleansing moment. Meanwhile, Epstein's lawyers kept hammering on about outside interference, insisting it was all a setup. And anyway, they said, you supposedly had such an archive of compromise on thousands of members of the global elite that the idea you'd take your own life strains credulity. Hard to swallow when we're talking about someone who had always managed to walk away untouched. Now let's dive into the part of your saga where everyone suddenly starts tiptoeing around in soft shoes. Because the word intelligence instantly turns casual talk into a minefield. Step left and you're in conspiracy territory. Step right and you're in scandal. And even standing still feels awkward. So where did the intelligence angle even come from? First, the travel map. Endless charters. The Virgin Islands, New York, Europe, the Middle East. Roots of a true nomad. Someone who never sticks to one country like a snail to a leaf. Then there's your social circle. You slipped effortlessly into rooms where outsiders don't belong. Politicians, military brass, retired spies, people with keys to safes full of secrets. On its own, that's not proof, but it does make you pause and ask, what if? Then there's the chatter from witnesses and acquaintances. After your death, a few people from your orbit hinted that you might not have been playing only your own game. The remarks were always slippery, never explicit, but they all carried the same subtext. You seemed too untouchable, too confident, in situations where ordinary market predators would already be sweating. Add your habit of collecting compromising material as leverage, and the theory starts snapping together like a puzzle, even without the picture on the box. Look at it soberly, without Hollywood special effects, and it's not about a caped superhero. It's about the mundane mechanics of covert operations. Capital opens doors. Doors create trust. Trust leads to loose talk and secrets. No codes, daggers, or shadowy rendezvous. Just psychology wrapped in luxury. In that setup, Epstein isn't James Bond. He's more like an orchestra conductor, a master of staging scenes and recording who stumbled where. That's why everyone hedges and mutters around this topic. There's no hard evidence, but the logic is glaring, and ignoring it feels like pretending not to see the elephant in the room. And this is where the whole saga really starts to burn, hotter than any rumor. The Epstein case didn't expose a grand conspiracy or dark puppet masters. It revealed something worse. It showed the true face of people who have spent years lecturing the world on how to live, how to vote, raise children, build utopias. Screen idols, politicians, tycoons, gurus. All those voices from podiums and stages suddenly looked less like knights in shining armor and more like members of a club where ethics are an optional extra. This story is a warped mirror the elite would rather not look into, because what it reflects is how easy it is to combine public sermons about equality, sustainability, and morality with private gatherings where questions aren't asked and silence is the most valuable currency. Not everyone there sinned equally, but far too many chose blindness until their own throne began to wobble. Classic, see no evil, hear no evil. And now the most important question of all. If the conspiracy theory holds any truth, the better question isn't who appears in the Epstein files, but why? Why now? And who gave the green light to release them? In our view, that's far more interesting than speculating about the names themselves.